Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The History of Rock and Roll, Volume 1, 1920 through 1963, by Ed Ward, narrated by David Colacci. How to use this book. This book is written to be heard from beginning to end, telling a story in sequential form, just like any other narrative history. It's possible to do this at much greater length and much greater detail. Witness Taylor Branch's magisterial three-part history of America's struggle for civil rights led by Martin Luther King, Jr., or Claude Manceron's almost novelistic five-parter on the French Revolution. But I wanted to make this story thorough yet accessible to the kind of people who don't enjoy gigantic reads as much as I do. I also wanted to try to impart the excitement I experienced once I grabbed a ride on what turned out to be a lot more than popular music, a corner that was turned after this book's narrative ends, but one we can see approaching by the end. I deliberately steered away from the great performer approach to this story, because although you can't ignore the Elvis Presleys and Ray Charleses here, the less well-known figures gave context to what they achieved and played their parts in shaping the eras in which they were active, often, in this part of the story, only in one part of the country to a non-mainstream audience. They were, many of them, rediscovered after their years in the spotlight and influenced a lot of music several decades later, which also gave many of them second careers. Also, the people who took it upon themselves to supply the music these people made to the marketplace of jukebox operators, radio stations, and record stores, record biz people like Sam Phillips, Sid Nathan, Art Roop, Mimi Trappell, Vivian Carter, Berry Gordy, Phil Spector, and Florence Greenberg, need their roles documented, and I've threaded them in among the performers, as well as songwriters and instrumentalists in this era before the writer-performer became the default model. To this end, I've tried to make the experience of listening to this book as smooth as possible, but there are a couple of places where the listener is presented with some long lists of names or songs and/or performers, as, for instance, the fat list of records released in 1957 that are considered essential classics today but never even hit the regional, let alone national charts. These should be welcomed as opportunities to explore. If you already know the material, you'll get the point, but if you don't, the ease of finding this music presented by online sources these days sets you up for hours of exploration and, I hope, enjoyment. Some of the sounds take a bit of getting used to, but I envy the person hearing this music for the first time, as I'm sure a lot of you would be doing. Make playlists, check out videos, or, as old-fashioned as it may seem, go deeper by buying actual CDs, which often have liner notes illuminating the music far deeper than I can, and, at their best, can provide an in-depth look at the performer or genre. And you may notice that with a cast of characters as large as this, many of them drop out of sight after their first appearance or after their careers take off. If listening to what I have to say about them here and your subsequent enjoyment of their music whets your interest, by all means pick up books dedicated entirely to them. Such authors as Peter Guralnick, his 2-volume biography of Elvis, and books dedicated to Sam Cooke and Sam Phillips are unparalleled. Robert Gordon, on Muddy Waters and Stax Records, R.J. Smith, Central Avenue and James Brown, and many others listed in the bibliography are the places to start. Only Pete Frame's astonishing Restless Generation, about British rock and roll up to 1960, wasn't published in the United States, but again, it's well worth finding. From the records and books, you can progress to the films, of which there are an increasing number, many of them well-researched documentaries. But don't stop at the documentaries. Some of the contemporary films are worth watching, too. I'd list The Girl Can't Help It, Jailhouse Rock, Rebel Without a Cause, and Blackboard Jungle as essential, and even the various films that exist mostly to highlight live performances and exploit what was perceived as a short-lived fad have fine performances wedged in with the less memorable ones. Later fiction films like Ray, about Ray Charles, La Bamba, Ritchie Valens, and American Hot Wax, Alan Freed, are very true to their subjects, while others push agendas. The Buddy Holly story famously omits Norman Petty entirely and callously misrepresents the Holly family, or, like Cadillac Records, ostensibly about chess records, warp history to make it more like what Hollywood thinks it should be. Armed with the facts, though, there are moments in all of them that are both relatively accurate and highly entertaining. In the end, though, this book is about the music and how it came to be made, and at the risk of repeating myself, I want you to use it as a springboard to new discoveries, new genres, and new performers. Pretty soon you'll be wondering why I haven't mentioned H. Bomb Ferguson or Ronnie Dawkins or the Slades. That's when you'll know I've done my job here. Rock and roll is a big world and contains many fascinating histories. Welcome to it. Tell us what you find. Ed Ward, Austin, Texas, November 2016. The History of Rock and Roll, Volume 1. Chapter 0. In the Beginning. In mid-19th century rural Southern America, which is as good a place as any to start this story, music wasn't something you did. Or, rather, it could have been just one of the things you did, if you did it, like smoking hams, mending the roof and the fences, and hoeing the vegetable patch. Black or white, northern or southern, rural life consisted of one job after another just to stay alive. Sometimes, particularly among African Americans, music accompanied work, as it also did among sailors or excavating crews. Field hollers may have been African survivals, and recordings of prisoners in the fields doing agricultural work, giving off with whoops and pieces of melody, sound eerie to our ears. Along with chain-gang songs and songs laborers sang while laying or mending railroad tracks, this music gave solidarity to groups of people engaged in common work. White rural people, who often lived close to blacks, especially in farming communities, had their own uses for music. Women, in particular, memorized long, ancient stories in the forms of ballads handed down through the generations, and often sang them doing women's work, like spinning, weaving, or sewing, or else used them as lullabies. Both groups sang communally in church, and both used instruments for socializing and to play music for dancing. Fiddle, which the whites had brought with them, along with a lot of its repertoire from the old country, and which blacks had picked up during slavery from the masters. Banjo, which was based on a West African instrument called the banjar, among many other names, and being easily made from things one had around, wood, hide, gut strings, caught on right away, and guitar, which, being store-bought, was precious, and at least at first not in common use. What's shocking to us these days is the extent to which black string band music from this area, some of which, performed by old men, was recorded in the 1930s by black folklorist John Work, sounds like white string band music. Poor rural people didn't worry as much about race as they did about survival, and more than one of the early string bands to record in the 1920s was biracial. A good tune was a good tune, and if one learned it from the other, that was how the process worked. Any variation or change was more likely up to the individual than to a folk tradition. But the important thing was, none of it was professional. It was a part of everyday life that existed around events like the annual hog butchering or the happy event of a friend's visit or a wedding, or simply to blow off steam after a week's work. It was, in the purest sense of the term, folk music. Which isn't to say that America didn't have professional showbiz back then. It was just limited to the cities. Rural people had neither money nor transportation, nor in most cases the inclination, to engage with the wandering troops of minstrels, light opera singers, and, after 1871, ensembles singing Negro spirituals who descended from the Fisk Jubilee singers. This branch of entertainment was for the middle class and up. It was performed by professionals, people who worked at making their art and were paid for it. And except for providing venues, a template for touring, and a few songs leaking into the folk pool, it doesn't have too much to do with our story. At least not until the very last days of the 1800s, when the phonograph was born. The earliest phonographs, once the world adopted Emil Berliner's disc format over Edison's cylinder, and Berliner's standard of playing from the outside in rather than Pathé's inside out, were sturdy furniture. They had to be. The acoustic signal coming off the disc through a steel or cactus thorn needle needed room for amplification in a large chamber, although the fascinated owners still had to sit close to the machine. You couldn't play a record in the next room and expect to hear it. What were people listening to? The kind of music people of their economic class, upper, middle, and above, might be expected to listen to included classics, light classics, operatic arias, songs from the musical theater that was thriving in New York, patriotic music. John Phillips Sousa's band was popular, and not just for his famous marches, since he composed other things for them, comic sketches from the vaudeville stage, often in Jewish, Negro, or Irish dialect, and the occasional novelty, like a Negro Jubilee ensemble singing spirituals, or even more novel, the Dinwiddie Colored Quartet's mashup of Dem Bones, with what sounds like a blackface minstrel comedy interlude. Off the record, independent of this mainstream, some major changes were happening. For one thing, medicine shows, a sort of low-rent spin-off of the touring minstrel show, began to appear in rural Southern America, bringing black and white performers, sometimes together, to communities that had never before seen professional entertainers. They'd play and sing and prepare the locals for a pitch for some miracle drug, mostly alcohol, with additives that could be anything from opium to gasoline, that would do incredible things, and was available just until the caravan pulled out of town for a low, low price. The people who performed at these shows were considered lowlifes by polite society, but out in the boondocks they were visitors from another world. If the medicine show was from far away, they might well be exposing the locals to instrumental styles and even forms of music they'd never heard before. In addition, the better-funded medicine shows handed out singers, cheap booklets with some of the songs performed in the show, thereby spreading everything from Stephen Foster songs to hymns and drinking songs to places where they'd been previously unknown. One singer was found to have had half its contents recorded by one actor or another during the 1920s and 30s. The medicine shows lasted almost a century and became laboratories for young musicians honing their performing skills and welcome employment for entertainers who were too rural for the vaudeville stage. Starting in the very last years of the 19th century, a new musical form emerged out of nowhere in the Deep South. Nobody can pinpoint the place or time when blues was invented, nor does it have a legendary inventor, but it did have a chronicler in the person of W.C. Handy, a trumpet player and bandleader from Memphis, who was famously waiting for a train in the early days of the 20th century in rural Tutwiler, Mississippi, when a ragged black man with a guitar sat down next to him and, running a knife blade over the strings, began to sing "The Weirdest Music I Ever Heard," improvising lyrics about the train they were waiting for. Handy went on to make much out of his discovery, even advertising himself as the father of the blues. But blues was an evolution from other black traditions, including the songster genre, which survived in the work of ragtime Texas Henry Thomas, Mississippi John Hurt, and Mance Lipscomb, among others, and is responsible for such black ballads as Frankie and Johnny, Stacko Lee, and the Titanic. Blues was actually something new and easy enough to write. In its classic form, the first two lines repeat, and then a third line closes the thought. Woke up this morning, blues all around my bed. Woke up this morning, blues all around my bed. I'll tell you people, they're the worst blues I've ever had. Some blues told stories, advancing the story, usually of heartbreak, verse by verse. Other blues were made up of what are called floating verses, like the one just quoted, or the blues would start with a story and go on to floating verses that fit the mood. Either way, the form had the advantage of having spaces between lines where an instrumentalist could play some licks, and the space between verses for more extended solo work. Blues probably started out being accompanied by guitars, which became more available as mail-order sources like Sears Roebuck and Company and Montgomery Ward found their way into rural areas. But the form lent itself to the piano, too, which meant that it soon spread to the cities, where blues singers, almost invariably female, wound up on the black vaudeville stages. Gertrude Ma Rainey, one of the first to find fame, was a centerpiece of the Rabbit-Foot Minstrels, one of the top black touring outfits, and her influence on younger singers was immense. The rise of urban blues was parallel to and to some extent integrated with the rise of the music that came to be called jazz. Although it was undeniably a popular music, far more popular than some of the other music of its time, jazz only concerns us here as an ingredient of other forms. It's worth noting that many jazz scholars consider the blues-singing women of the 1920s as jazz musicians, while ignoring or discounting rural blues performers. The harmonic structure of blues, however, was with jazz from its very earliest days, and the power of the word is evident in the way songs that aren't blues at all, W.C. Handy's St. Louis Blues, to give a prominent example, use the word, if not the form. If blues was a central ingredient to black music in the Deep South, there was another form that arrived about the same time that was just as important on the eastern seaboard: ragtime. This was a piano-based, composed and notated, syncopated musical form that came into being simultaneously with the earliest jazz, and in many of the same venues. Ragtime might be what the piano professor was playing in whorehouses with enough class to have a parlor with a piano, but it quickly escaped its seedy origins to become a fad in vaudeville and the politer parlors of the middle class. Most notably, it was promoted by the sheet music publishers, who had Scott Joplin, a black pianist with some training, under contract. Joplin was hardly the only ragtime composer to make money for an ambitious publisher, but his prodigious output included music for small instrumental ensembles and an opera, among other works. And while ragtime wasn't particularly transposable to the guitar, its ideas were, and so guitarists who heard pianists playing a form of ragtime called barrel house in turpentine camps in Georgia tried out the harmonies and came up with intricate finger-picking techniques to form melodies on them, and invented a guitar style that mimicked the multiple lines and tricky rhythms of the piano music. This became the basis of the black rural popular music of Georgia and the Carolinas. Another place where ragtime's ideas showed up was in the medicine shows, where comic songs were common. Again, the chord progressions made a great base for a type of music that became known as hokum, which spread to both the black and white traditions. White medicine show performers like Uncle Dave Macon and harmonica Frank Floyd salted their repertoires with hokum, and black performers in Memphis made it a signature of the city's music, as it was largely what the jug bands there played. Gus Cannon of Cannon's Jug Stompers had a long career with the shows, as well as the successful Memphis Sheiks. Not surprisingly, all these groups were in high demand among the city's moneyed whites for party entertainment. These developments happened slowly, and they didn't all happen in the same places at the same time, since there was no mass media even remotely interested in this minority interest stuff. and in some places they didn't happen at all. But soon after the end of World War I, enough of these new sounds were in evidence for the immense changes that would come in the 1920s and kick off the arrival of a distinctly American wave of music. Chapter 1. The Record Industry. Race and Country. On February 14th, or maybe August 10th, it wasn't considered important enough to keep notes, 1920, a black vaudeville singer took advantage of another singer's canceled session to cut a record. Mamie Smith was backed by a band assembled by Perry Bradford, a young black veteran of minstrel shows, songwriter, and what would today be called record producer, who'd convinced the fledgling OK Records label that black people owned phonographs in sufficient quantity to buy records. He'd worked with Smith before, when she'd recorded two of his tunes, That Thing Called Love and You Can't Keep a Good Man Down, and the record had sold between 50,000 and 100,000 copies, a very respectable number. When the opportunity to record her again came along, he grabbed two more of his songs and gave them to her. Crazy Blues wasn't even a blues song, but it was the first song with blues in the title to be recorded. It sold 75,000 copies in a month and over 1 million copies in its first year, making Smith the star, giving Bradford the chance to work with other up-and-coming stars like Louis Armstrong, putting OK Records on the map and igniting a craze for blues. Female blues singers suddenly appeared on records singing blues songs that actually were blues songs, and, curiously enough, many of them were named Smith. Bessie, Alberta, Clara, and Trixie, among others. Most of them adopted the elaborate gowns, big hats, and flashy jewelry that Mamie had introduced as blues singer attire, and sang songs in the classic AAB form. They didn't just come out of the blue. A woman named Gertrude Ma Rainey had been singing blues for years in an act with her husband as Assassinators of the Blues. At first, the Raineys toured with the famous Rabbitfoot Minstrels, a show in which, much later, young Rufus Thomas began a career that would make him a Memphis icon well into the second half of the century, and then they graduated into a series of tent shows. Ma Rainey didn't leap on Mamie Smith's bandwagon, but when she did start recording in 1923, she made over 100 sides. The label she recorded for is worth noting. Paramount Records was a spin-off of the Wisconsin Chair Company in Port Washington, Wisconsin, which had started making Victrolas as they became popular. In 1917, they decided to form a record company to make something to play on them. The first Paramount releases were the usual mixed bag of stuff: Hawaiian tunes, Irish novelties, comic routines, and for some reason a lot of marimba orchestra records. Then Mamie Smith woke them up, and they announced that they were entering what was beginning to be called the race market. Their first star was Alberta Hunter, a genteel vocalist who could do pop as well as blues, and her success alerted a former NFL player and graduate of Brown University, J. Mayo Ink Williams, to a possibility. Williams had been hanging around Chicago doing small-time hustles, and one day he headed to Port Washington to talk to Paramount. He later remembered the walk from the train station, with little kids staring at him, and the more adventurous ones touching him. They'd never seen a black person before. Williams told Paramount that he knew the black music world well. Didn't he live in Chicago, a mecca of African-American music-making? And when he discovered they needed someone to run their new recording studio in Chicago, a deal was made. Williams went right to work. Before long, he'd recorded Papa Charlie Jackson, a popular banjo-playing street performer from Chicago, blues singers Ma Rainey, Ethel Waters, Ida Cox, and further sessions for Alberta Hunter, and jazz musicians, largely but not entirely from New Orleans, who had found a ready audience in Chicago, like Fletcher Henderson, Freddie Keppard, King Oliver, with and without Louis Armstrong, and Ferdinand Lament, who called himself Jelly Roll Morton. Williams didn't even like blues. He was more partial to classical music, but considered it part of his people's heritage. This resulted in his being open to blues besides the kind played on the vaudeville stages. A Paramount dealer in Dallas alerted Williams to a street performer who was drawing good crowds, and Williams sent for him. It was a wise investment. Blind Lemon Jefferson was phenomenally popular and recorded close to 100 sides for Paramount before his mysterious death in Chicago in 1929. Some of his songs became classics, and Matchbox Blues was recorded by Carl Perkins and by the Beatles. As if that weren't enough of a claim on immortality, Jefferson's lead boys, youngsters he'd hired to guide him along the streets, included Aaron T-Bone Walker and Joshua White. Jefferson's success opened the door for other guitar-playing blues performers of a rural bent. Blind Arthur Blake, a guitar virtuoso about whom absolutely nothing is known for certain, recorded close to 80 sides for Paramount before vanishing as mysteriously as he came, preserving a guitar style that has great hunks of jazz and ragtime in it. Williams really lucked out by forming a relationship with H.C. Spear, a white store owner in Jackson, Mississippi's black neighborhood, who took notice of the fact that there was a lot of black musical talent in the surrounding area. They'd come in and buy gramophones from him, and records, too. Spear's innovation was to buy a recording machine so that he could cut demos of people who wanted to record and send them on to record companies, who'd pay him a finder's fee if the artist was of interest. Spear was by no means exclusively dealing with Paramount. He also sent performers to Victor and Decca, and most famously, later got Robert Johnson hooked up with the American Recording Company, which was eventually absorbed by Columbia. But he hit gold with Williams, up until his mysterious departure from Paramount in 1927. The label began sending tickets to many of Spear's finds to come up to Wisconsin to record, and Spear sent some of the less commercial artists up there, including Charlie Patton, who was a bridge between the songster and blues traditions and a great mentor to everyone from Johnson to Roebuck Staples, who later founded the gospel sensations the Staple Singers, and Chester Burnette, later known as Howlin' Wolf, and Nehemiah Skip James, whose career suffered from Paramount's not promoting his 1931 records, and by James getting religion later that year. Spear also sent Williams Patton's friend and rival Son House, the mysterious King Solomon Hill, Ishman Bracey, Tommy Johnson, and Geechee Wiley and L.V. Thomas, whose identities weren't confirmed until the 21st century, to Paramount Studios to make records that would be rediscovered 30 years later by a totally different audience from the one they were made for. Country blues like this didn't sell spectacularly, although some artists like Tommy Johnson and the piano-guitar duo of Scrapper Blackwell and Leroy Carr certainly justified their record company's investment in them, and other artists like Patton sold well enough in small regions where they were popular through live performances to be asked back to do further sessions. Hokum and Jug Band records also did well, with the Mississippi Sheiks, the Memphis Jug Band, and Cannon's Jug Stompers selling respectively, in part because they were popular with white people in Memphis, where they lived. Essentially, record companies were initiating a tradition: record it and see if it sells. Paramount was far from the only company getting into the race music market. Most companies that dared going after such an uncertain audience just dipped a toe in, and the usual thing was to treat race music as just one of a number of small markets that might produce a return with a left-field smash like Crazy Blues. OK, Mamie Smith's label, was run by a German immigrant named Otto K. Heinemann, and was a bit more dedicated to minority music, including Yiddish music, but most race labels concentrated on jazz, because it had a crossover white audience from the start and was beginning a golden era with artists like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington. It was also produced in urban centers like New York and Chicago, close to.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?